Welcome to another episode of my Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I get to know people a little bit and I save getting to know them a lot more for the podcast because you, our listeners and our viewers who see some of the videos that sometimes go up, you're interested in not just what our guests do or what they have done, but how they came to do it. And I'm really thrilled to have CharlieCarmada on. It's not every day you get to meet a real life astronaut. Dr. Charles Carmada, Charlie to his friends, and I guess I'm one of his friends, was selected as an astronaut candidate in 1996 and flew as a mission specialist on STS-114, which is NASA's return to flight mission immediately following the Columbia disaster of 2003, and which we all watched and rubbernecked, and the tragedy just hit all of us, and it claimed the lives of its 7 crew. He was responsible for initiating several teams to successfully diagnose the cause of the Columbia tragedy and developing an in-orbit repair capability used on successive shuttle missions until the retirement of the space shuttle in 2011. As well as being an astronaut, he is a research engineer, inventor, author, educator, and internationally recognized expert and speaker on engineering design, safety, organizational behavior, and education. He has over 60 technical publications, holds 9 patents, and over 20 national and international awards. And he's been inducted into the Air and Space Cradle of Aviation Museum's Hall of Fame in 2017. Charlie, that's a lot to live up to.
Yeah, it sounds really good when you say it, Mark. Thank you.
No. And Charlie he's one of these delightful characters who doesn't take himself too seriously, but he takes life seriously, especially when people's lives are at stake. But I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone, which is, if you were to say what matters most to you, if you were to step back and say what matters most to me, and I think it's mattered most to me maybe throughout my life, tell us what that is, and what were some of the roots of that? What were some of the roots growing up that where you notice things maybe that other people didn't notice? And tell us about that.
You know, that's a tough question, Mark. And usually I have lots of different interests, but boiling it down, I think the thing that matters to me most throughout my entire life has been learning. And I love to talk to educated people. I love to learn. I love to question things. And so even growing up as a young child, I questioned everything. And luckily, I was raised by parents, and my mother especially, that showed me how to find answers to things. Didn't just shut me down and say, "Oh, stop asking silly questions. Here's how you go out and find it." And so I was drawn in. That's what drew me into science, right, and engineering, and trying to discover and research, learning things that people did not know, maybe validating and verifying things that were being hypothesized. And so learning, education, and science and research were, I guess, the real passion in me from a very early age.
And take us back to when you were younger. And I mean, research is a big word to use for a 5 or 6-year-old, but can you share early on some of the things that you threw yourself into, or some of the things that just amazed you? You're actually reminding me of one of my late mentors, Larry King. And Larry King
Wow.
was just curious about everything. And I had him on the podcast. He was actually my first guest on the podcast. And you'll appreciate this. He grew up in Brooklyn. And he said, I didn't care about what ice cream tasted like. He said, I do now. He said, I like vanilla at Thrifty's. But he said, when I was young, I wanted to know how they made ice cream. and I was just curious about everything. And uh, and my curiosity apparently captured the attention of my viewers and listeners through life, because what I was curious about, it seemed like a lot of other people were curious about, and I was just kind of a vehicle for sharing that. So, uh, any childhood memories about some things that really wowed you?
Yeah, I grew up during the first space race, in the early 50s and 60s, when it was us against the Russians. And so, how do rockets work? And I was just diving into that. Even when I was very young, I would go to this, I would go to the pharmacy, and I would have a list of things that I needed: lampblack, which was charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, and the things that you need to make rocket fuel. And I would experiment in my basement on my own, trying to make something work to actually propel something into space. And I remember I tried and I tried and I failed and I failed. And I had an uncle that used to work for Grumman way back when they built the lunar module. And he was a physicist, and I got him interested in it. And so together he showed me, how do you put the sulfur into a little cylinder? How do you create a little nozzle that creates the thrust? And how do you put a stabilizer on it? And then how do you launch it? And we would try and we would fail. And together we were actually able to do it. And I remember, my uncle was one of the first people that had a science background that I could relate to, and was a mentor, and to actually help me accomplish these things. Otherwise, I would still be tinkering, trying to get something to actually fly, much like my good buddy Homer Hickam, only instead of Coldwood, West Virginia, I was in Queens, New York.
And can you remember the first time it actually worked?
Oh, absolutely. We had family over in a little connected houses in Queens, New York. We were in the backyard. My father had a little barbecue. We had uncles and aunts over, and we launched it from my backyard. It went up over the houses into the street. We went running out of my backyard, and went to find out where the rocket landed. And I was just jumping up and down. I had to be like maybe 10 years old, 11 years old.
Wow, wow. And then, so after that victory, after all those failures, share a little bit, about, I guess at 10 years of age, you hadn't yet entered junior high, but tell us a little bit about those years, and then take us up into, into college and beyond.
Sure. Junior high school, I went to Archbishop Malloy High School, all boys Catholic high school. My mother thought I needed to, get a little more discipline in my life. I had been getting into a little bit of trouble with the nuns in my elementary school. And it was there that, I always had this passion for science, and anything related to science. And so we did some very early testing early on, and I found out that the most likely careers that I should pursue would probably be in engineering, chemical engineering, mechanical engineering. I had some friends that had gone to Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn. And since I wanted to be an astronaut, I figured, well, aerospace engineering is probably the right place for me. And so upon graduation from Archbishop Malloy, I applied, I really believe, only to Brooklyn Polytech. I didn't want to go outside of New York. I wanted to stay local. And Brooklyn Polytech had a phenomenal aerospace engineering department back in that time. And so that's what really honed my skills and education in engineering, and especially aerospace engineering.
And then where did you go after that?
After that, luckily, when in between my junior and senior year at Brooklyn Polytech, one of the teachers, Professor Pasquale Sforza, asked our class, who would like to do an internship at NASA? And so immediately my hand went up with two other kids, and I got to do an internship at NASA Langley. And when you take engineering, there are lots of different areas you could specialize in, especially aerospace. You can go into fluid mechanics, aeronautics, structural mechanics, controls. And so the internship at NASA Langley in Hampton, Virginia, I had this amazing mentor, Dr. James Starnes, and worked with amazing people on a project that was in the structures area of structures and structural optimization. And it was there I was presented to what research was. And I gained an understanding of what research was. And I realized that, of everything I really wanted to do, I wanted to be a researcher. I wanted to discover things that other people did not really know. And so when I graduated, I applied to NASA Langley and was accepted. And that's when I started my career at NASA Langley as a research engineer. And the area I chose was called thermal structures, thermal mechanics. And what we did was we specialized in all systems and subsystems that you design and use for hypersonic flight, vehicles that fly 5 to 25 times the speed of sound.
But in the back of your mind was still, I'm going to be an astronaut. Was that still present? Or, and again, I know what there is about Charlie. Obviously people rubberneck that particular event in his life, but that was just a singular event. Charlie will say, even though people are interested in that, it doesn't define me. I mean, I've had a full life of interest in science and learning and education, but people will rubberneck back to, tell us about, and I'm going to say it, tell us about becoming an astronaut. When did it start to take form, and did it take form prior to the Columbia disaster? I mean, were you already in training for that? And tell us about that period, and then also tell us, if you will, about the impact of the Columbia disaster on you.
Yeah, sure. I always had this dream of becoming an astronaut, not really knowing exactly what I would be doing. And so I figured I needed to work at NASA. And so my first job there was in research. And then all of a sudden, after I was working there for about 3 years, the astronaut office started looking for astronauts that came from not only test pilot population across the country. So they were taking mission specialists, what became known as mission specialists. And so I was the first applicant to apply as a mission specialist back in 1978, but I knew it would be very difficult for me to be selected because I had the minimum requirements. I had only a BS degree and only 3 years experience at work, but I applied anyway. I got a letter of rejection. I remember writing to astronaut Michael Collins, who was at this Air and Space Museum, to find out if he could help give me some tips on how to become an astronaut and how to be successful. And so I was rejected. But and so I pursued my career in research, getting advanced degrees, master's, and then PhD. And I loved what I was doing. And it got to a point where I was training. I went for management training at Wallops Island. I met people from Johnson Space Flight Center that said, Charlie, if you really want to be an astronaut, you have about 2 weeks. They have another call for astronauts. You should apply. And it so happened that I had just gotten custody of my daughter. I was divorced, and so I really didn't reapply to be an astronaut because I wouldn't leave the state of Virginia without my daughter. And so I said, I'll give it another shot. I was 44 years old. And when I drove back from Wallops Island to Virginia Beach, filled out all the paperwork, and then the rest was history. I got the call. My daughter agreed. She was 8 years old. She agreed to go with me. She said it would be an adventure. It was no problem for her. She was a very courageous little kid. And we took that journey. We went to Johnson Space Flight Center. I was in the largest astronaut class in 1996. We had 44 astronauts from 11 international astronauts from 7 different countries. And we proceeded to train for two years, a little over 2 years, to be astronauts. We were astronaut candidates. Then we graduate and we could be selected for a mission. And it was I was actually training as a backup crew for an International Space Station mission when the Columbia accident happened. And so I was in Russia. We got the call and we heard that we lost the crew on February 1st, 2003.
What was the impact of that on you?
Well, I can tell you, we were devastated. It was at nighttime in Russia. We ran into the cottages. We had 3 small cottages there where the astronauts, the U.S. had built facilities for the U.S. astronauts to live, and we watched it on TV. And I saw this very large piece of foam fly off the external tank and hit a very critical part of the underbelly of the orbiter vehicle. And I had done a lot of work in thermal protection systems. I knew this was serious. And I was enraged that 2 weeks prior to that launch, when they knew this piece of foam hit the vehicle, people didn't think this was a problem. And so I had these mixed emotions. I was terribly sad. I lost 3 classmates, 7 of them, all were my friends. But I was angry. I became enraged. I was just so overwhelmed with anger that NASA, Johnson Space Flight Center, made the wrong decision and didn't get in touch with the right people to help them realize that this was a problem.
Wow. And did you raise the objection? Did you what did you do with your anger? Because if you got so angry that people couldn't manage your anger, you probably wouldn't have been on the next flight. So what was that period like between that flight and when you were on the next flight?
Well, to tell you the truth, Mark, I was shocked that I was selected for the next flight, because when I came back to the astronaut office, that anger manifested itself and was very obvious. I was questioning everything the program managers were saying. People were very defensive in the shuttle program office, in the safety offices, the flight controllers, the flight directors. They were circling the wagons. And I was confronting these same people that made this bad decision. What I saw they were just as arrogant. Even after they made this very bad decision, they were not contrite. They did not own up to the mistakes they made, and they were continuing to make more mistakes. And so as I'm watching this, I went to the head of the astronaut office, and I told him, I really don't need to be an astronaut anymore. We're not going to fly for at least another 2.5 years, even though people mistakenly thought that we could fly in a matter of weeks. We could be up and flying again. I knew we wouldn't be. It would take us that long to figure out what the problem was and to make sure we could fly safe. And I told my boss, Charlie Precourt, I said, I don't need to be in the astronaut office. I've worked at NASA for 22 years on a lot of joint programs with the Air Force, classified programs in hypersonics. I know just the right people to pull together to solve these problems. Let me go off and do that. And he said, no, Charlie, you could stay and do it as an astronaut. And he provided me a little bit of cover, even though I continued to upset the people that were leading the return to flight program. Because once again, NASA did not choose the right people to lead, which was what was going to be a research and development program. They picked people like flight directors to lead these programs. And so things were happening very slowly. People were making mistakes. And I basically went outside the program, called up my good friends at the research centers. Some of them were center directors. and chief engineers at these research centers, and I selected just the right people that I needed to put together a team to understand the physics of the impact problem and to prove that that's what caused the damage to the vehicle. Even though I was told not to do it, I did it anyway.
And did they take your research into consideration to correct the problems?
Well, what they did was, once they realized that NASA did have the right people to solve this problem, only Johnson Space Flight Center, their engineers did not know what was going on at the research centers. And once I put together the team, we presented the team and the research program that we laid out of how they would rapidly do analysis and testing to validate their numerical models to simulate impact damage. They let that team basically take the lead. And they took me off the program, put someone else in charge of it, but the team had the right leaders. I picked the right people to lead those teams, and they made the right decisions. And in only 3 months' time, they were able to solve a problem that NASA had been trying to solve for over 30 years.
Really? And they picked you off the team which you had assembled, and they picked you off it to prepare you to be an astronaut, or?
No. They took me off the team because, once again, Johnson Space Flight Center wanted to lead. They did not want me to have any recognition for being the one that was leading this team. And even though this wasn't my area of expertise, I knew the right people to put on the team. And I knew the way they should construct the knowledge by going and doing these building block experimental tests and analyses. So the team was solid. I picked the right people, and they managed to do the right thing.
And so where did you go after you left the team?
Oh, after I left the team, there were other problems that I was basically going in all these different meetings and overseeing and watching what other people were trying to do to understand the physics of the problem. And I became interested in the people that were trying to develop solutions in case we fly again. What technology do we develop to make sure that we wouldn't have an accident? So I was looking at inspection teams, developing technology to inspect the vehicle to make sure when we're in orbit that it's safe, doesn't have any damage. And the other team that I played a major role in was basically a repair team. The teams were looking at ways to repair the wing and also the belly of the vehicle, shuttle tiles, if they were damaged by foam. How could we basically effect the repair by using 2 spacewalking astronauts on orbit to repair the vehicle, patch the holes so that we could fly back safely? And they were struggling. And so once again, I had to go covert. I went off the radar in my friend's garage, and we started looking at repair techniques for fixing the wing leading edge, which was an area that I was very familiar with. I spent many years researching wing leading edges and especially these advanced materials. And so we came up with a solution to the problem that the program was not able to come up with in my friend's garage, another astronaut, Don Pettit. And we took that idea and we presented it to the program office. And then the program office took our idea, gave it to a contractor, and they developed the repair patches that I eventually flew in space.
So as I'm listening to you, I'm looking at the world through your eyes, and there's something that you are able to see that other people don't see, or they're preoccupied, or they're caught up in politics or something. And I think that continues to exist now in the way you look at the world and the problems of the world. And you see things that are either being minimized or ignored. And it's almost like they're hidden in plain sight. And you've developed a way to explore them and research them. Do you think that's accurate?
No, I'm surprised you were able to figure that out, Mark. But really, I'm not surprised knowing you. But that's exactly right. And see, the difference is, and this is what I talk a little bit about in the book that I've been trying to write for the past several years. It's that research culture. The way I was raised and the branch that I was in charge of, that I was the branch head of a branch called the thermal structures branch. We worked with multiple different disciplines and expertise. We had people in our branch that had expertise in multiple different areas: structures, materials, thermal stress analysis, aerothermodynamics, heating, heat transfer. And we solved these problems as a synergistic integrated team. And these problems are coupled problems. There's not any one discipline can solve these problems, but it's a way of looking at these problems and understanding the interactions that happen across the interfaces of these different disciplines that allows me to see problems that took me years to get the program office to see that these were critical problems. Yet people that were raised like me at NASA Langley, in my branch and other branches, could see very quickly. And so, and when I understood that I lacked some knowledge in a particular area, I knew exactly who to go to, the know-who with the know-how, to pull them in, like my good friend Pete Naffo, to tell me. He was the aerothermodynamicist. I said, Pete, why are these patches on the outside of the wing, why are they burning up? Can we do a parametric analysis to figure out how to design these patches so they don't burn up? Because if they stick out into the flow, the hypersonic flow will hit these edges and exacerbate the heating and cause them to burn up. And in one day, Pete Naffo ran several cases, and he basically gave me the solution. And so this interdisciplinary problem-solving technique, knowing how to pull those right people into the network with the right knowledge at the right time to accelerate the learning of that team and rapidly come to a solution. Those are the things that I'd like to discuss in a book for other people to learn how to do that. Because although the National Science Foundation talks a lot about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary convergence and why we need this, not too many people really know how to do that.
So, do you have a title for your book that you're working on?
Well, the unofficial title, I'm still working on it, is called NASA, Houston, You Have a Problem, and America, It's Your Problem. And the real heart of the book is not so much the bad decisions that were made and the dysfunctional culture of high reliability organizations like NASA and why they continue to make these recurring mistakes which cause disasters. But the underlying message of the book is that we as a nation have minimized or reduced the amount of applied research we do in this country. It's almost non-existent at NASA right now. Yeah, NASA does amazing things, and there are pockets where we do some research in small areas, but very little money has been earmarked for applied research over the past 30, 35 years. This is a national problem. We're seeing it right now where you're reading about in the news how the United States is lagging China and Russia in hypersonic technology, which I was very much a part of during the NAS program in the early days of the National Aerospace Plane. We used to lead the world in hypersonics. And right now we are far behind, and we're far behind in education. And so when you think about it, if we're behind in hypersonic research, and countries like China are producing 100 times or 1,000 times more the number of engineers than the United States, we're in serious trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes come up with cute titles. So something just flashed on me. So can I share it with you? It's just a cute title. You can write
I'm
it down.
gonna I'm gonna be writing it down, Mark, because I you're amazing at this, and you probably have a better title.
So this is a first draw at it. Hidden in plain flight, as opposed to hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain, and plain can be PLAIN or PLANE, but it's using something that I call mental real estate. When you come up with something that is a familiar term and you twist it, people are drawn into the familiarity. And then when you twist it, you have mental real estate. A friend of mine designed Disney Tokyo and Disney Paris, and he shared that term with me, mental real estate. He said Pirates of the Caribbean owns the word pirates in the minds of kids. So Disney owns pirates. So hidden in plain flight, people will immediately say, what's that about? But it's so evocative. And then what I think we're talking about, this I'm not so clear about, but how confirmation bias created, it turned American know-how into American myopia. Because what happens is people just they have tunnel vision, and then they have confirmation bias, and they can't see dots outside of it. And what it does is it creates myopia, and that turns know-how into lag behind. So those are just
you're absolutely right. What you are describing is exactly, when I talk about in the book, I talk about this research DNA. We had this DNA. This is what made us great. And it didn't start with NASA. It started with NACA, right? And that same thirst for knowledge, that curiosity, that research mindset led the creation of the Space Task Group, which led to NASA. And these same people that had that research DNA were at high positions within the organization, and that gradually disappeared. Right. And so when you talk about confirmation bias and myopia, what you're talking about are these two teams. They're not really teams, they're working groups. One of them was the O-ring working group, and the other one was this group that was in charge of the wing leading edge. It was called the LESSPRT, the Leading Edge Structural Subsystem Problem Resolution Team. And these people thought they knew everything they could possibly know about the wing leading edge. They were very much confirmation bias. It was groupthink. They didn't look at people outside their little group. They didn't entertain a discourse. They didn't entertain candid discussion or disruption within the group. So you couldn't have these conversations where other people had other ideas. And so they very much could not see. And this is what happened after I flew in space. That same group that made the mistake and thought STS-107, Columbia, was safe to come home, I found the problem on my wing leading edge that they were covering up because they didn't think it was a systemic problem. And it took me a year to convince that group and to convince NASA to stop flying. They were continuing to fly 8 missions with these anomalies on the wing leading edge that could have caused a disaster.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And so it happens. And then these groups, because they're in power, they think that they are the air quotes experts, and people listen to them, even though they talk about things that are outside their knowledge base, and they try to silence this dissenting opinions, which and unfortunately that goes on today. It went on right after the accident. So the culture was not able to correct itself, and so I think the novelty of my book is that I realized that these high-risk organizations, I've yet to find one case where an entire organization was actually able to successfully transform their culture. It happens in these less risky organizations, like maybe automobiles or other products where you produce millions of things. They don't have devastating consequences and loss of life, and changing the management at a high level and imposing certain new policies, getting rid of certain maybe bad actors in the organization could help transform the company and make it financially sound, the way Mullally, the ex-CEO of Boeing, did with Ford back in the day, took it out of bankruptcy. But it's not going to work with high-risk organizations. High-risk organizations are working on very complex machinery, which has thousands of millions of components which interact, and they're very fragile systems. One very small changes could have devastating results. And so it's a very fragile system. You have to constantly monitor it. You have to identify weak signals where you see something that could be wrong. You address it immediately with the right team, because it's impossible to predict the failure of these systems because they are complex systems.
So here's another book title. I'm listening to you, but I'm in my book title mode. The Rise and Fall of Research DNA. And then the subtitle is How America Can Correct This and Catch up and move ahead of the rest of the world. But the rise and fall of research DNA, because that when you said that, I'm thinking it's a whole way of approaching things, which is about finding the answers to problems as opposed to just trying to reinforce what you know and having zero curiosity to be proven wrong. So
yeah, I mean, you're seeing it right now. We saw it during the pandemic, right? You had these very smart people that had expertise in one area, but this is an entire ecosystem that requires many different disciplines to understand this disease and how it spreads and how it is transmitted. And people were silencing people that had dissenting opinions. Right? We're seeing it play out in real time. Instead of people admitting, I do not know everything, and admitting to the public that, they come across as if they know everything. And then they end up saying things that are outside their area of expertise that they have to come back and change, right?
Right. This is fascinating. And what you don't know about my podcast, or maybe you've listened to some, the whole purpose of it is to whet my listeners' appetite to find out more about my guests. So even when someone's coming on to push a book, really, I want them to be evergreen episodes so that after the book goes away, my listeners' interest in my guest doesn't go away. And so that's why I try to have these kind of meandering conversations, and you've more than whet their appetite to find out more about you and what you're up to. And a lot of my listeners are going to now start staying curious about what Charlie does next. So how can people find out more about you and where you are?
My website is CharlieCarmada.com. You could reach me through LinkedIn. You could reach me at my email, charles.j.camarda@gmail.com. I have a educational nonprofit called the Epic Education Foundation. And so you can reach me at charlie@epiceducationfoundation.org. And my areas of interest are really, transforming education, transforming the way you put together high-performing teams to solve what I call epic challenges. And I'd love to chat. And what's interesting, Mark, is that this whole book has changed where it's going. And so as I do more research for the book, I meet other people and I have other discussions, and I'm constantly learning. And so I hope to do a podcast about research and about my experiences at NASA and take it in some different areas, because it reinforces and it helps me to learn and gain more knowledge as to how to make these changes. How can we effectively change these cultures so that we can change the culture of an entire organization and make it healthy again? Because my real purpose is not to bash NASA, but to help NASA recreate itself, to reimagine itself, to regain its past glory and its lost core ideology.
Yeah, and I can tell that. Something that you downplay, you have an amazingly engaging personality. And a lot of people don't think of researchers as having any personality. And if you're listening in, or if you see a video of this, you'll see what I'm talking about. And if you're wanting to transform education and you're listening in, or you happen to see this podcast, your students would really like Charlie. And again, we're not trying to make this a cult of personality, but, it doesn't hurt to have your students actually think, I like this guy. He dares to be different. He has this thick accent. You'd think he'd use it in Virginia. And, he probably has Nathan's hot dogs in his freezer. He's like a regular guy. So if you're listening in and you're thinking about transforming education and you're thinking of engaging your students, you really need to reach out to Charlie, because he has the sizzle of his personality, but he has the steak of actually really being a researcher. So he's the whole package. So do follow up with him. Please do. And thank you, Charlie, for being on. And to our listeners, thank you for supporting the podcast. We really appreciate it. And leave your reviews so that we can do an even better job and have more characters on like Charlie.
Thanks, Mark. It was a pleasure. I love listening to you, buddy.
Well, I love listening to you too. And I love that we've become friends. So to everyone out there, take good care when wake-up calls come your way. Chuck the confirmation bias and just see what the wake-up call is trying to tell you. It's trying to give you a message, so wake up and hear it.